President, please be seated. The chamber is now back in session. And court officer, you are instructed to bring the expert into the courtroom. President, good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Mr. Expert. What is your name?
Stephen Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. When were you born?
January 10th, 1949.
Please.
I apologize, Mr. President, but in the French booth, the beginnings of each answer that the expert has been providing to us have not been audible. So if you could please remind him to wait a little bit so that we don't lose any of what's being said.
President, thank you. So it depends on the person who controls the microphone for the expert. The expert himself did not control the microphone. What is your nationality, Mr. Expert?
Australian.
Thank you. And where is your current address? And what is your occupation? Please wait.
My current address is Silver Spring, Maryland. I am a researcher and writer, as well as a teacher of international politics and history.
Thank you. What religion do you practice?
Not religious.
Thank you. Based on the report by the greffier this morning, that based on your knowledge, you have no relationship by blood or by law to the two accused, that is Nuon Chi and Kheo Sampon, or to civil parties admitted in this case. Is this report correct?
Yes, the court is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Pursuant to Internal Rule 31(2) of the Internal Rules of the ECCC, in your capacity as an expert who testify in this courtroom, the chamber require you to take an oath based on your religion before you provide your testimony in this courtroom. Do you agree to do so?
Yes, I agree.
International greffier Mr. Hassan, please lead the expert to take an oath in this courtroom.
Good afternoon, Mr. Expert. Can you please stand and repeat after me? I solemnly swear that I will assist the trial chamber honestly, confidentially, and to the best of my ability.
I solemnly swear that I will assist the trial chamber honestly, confidentially, and to the best of my ability.
Thank you. Please be seated.
President, thank you. The chamber and parties in this courtroom would like to thank you, Mr. Morris, for spending your valuable time to travel all the way from overseas to provide testimony in this courtroom. And your testimony may contribute to the ascertaining of the truths that are related to important informations that are quite essential for this court and also for the Cambodian people. Now I would like to ask you a number of preliminary questions related to your work and your writing. And my first question is about your writing and publications. Can you tell us about your qualification, your education?
Yes, I have a doctorate in political science from Columbia University. I have been a research fellow at Harvard University and at Columbia University and at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. I am also qualified by virtue of the fact that in 1983 I visited guerrilla-controlled areas of Cambodia and met with leaders of the Democratic Kampuchea faction, the Phun Sen Pek faction, and the Khmer People's National Liberation Front faction, which were fighting the Vietnamese. Furthermore, I believe I'm the only academic who has had an extensive, private, 1.5-hour interview with His Royal Highness Prince Norodom Sihanouk in 1985. I have published widely not only a book by Stanford University Press called Why Vietnam Invaded Cambodia, but also in many magazines such as the Atlantic Monthly and newspapers such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. I have also had the good fortune and unique fortune to have been able to work in the archives of the Russian Federation on the history of the Vietnam War and the war in Cambodia.
Thank you. What about other studies of yours? Can you tell us the specific studies of yours that are related to DK regime or Democratic Kampuchea regime?
Yes, I think that my book, Why Vietnam Invaded Cambodia, is the most relevant of my studies, which contains all of the source material that I have just mentioned to you. But I have written a lot about my experiences with the democratic Kampuchea regime after 1979, not experiences before 1979. But my book contains an analysis of the nature of the democratic Kampuchea regime and gives my interpretation of why they behaved the way that they did.
Thank you. Before we continue, I would like to suggest to the expert to speak slower so that your answer can be translated fully and well. And for your thesis that you mentioned earlier, related to your PhD thesis with the title The Origins of the Soviet-Vietnamese Alliance, and related to this PhD thesis, when did you start doing it, and why you decided to choose such topic for your research, especially for your PhD dissertation?
Yes, I began my work on this in 1979 or 1980. I don't remember exactly the year that I began my research, but 1979 or 1980. The reason for my interest in the subject was the fact that I had been to Vietnam during the war in 1970 and in 1972. I had seen the situation in Vietnam and knew that the situation was very different to what I had believed it to be, and therefore I have always attempted to base my research, at least in part, upon personal contact with the people who are making history that I'm writing about. So my interest in the Soviet-Vietnamese alliance is derived in part from my interest in the Vietnam War, but in part from the fact that I have some training in Soviet studies, or I had some training in Soviet studies at Columbia University in pursuant of my dissertation and my PhD.
Thank you. What were the important issues that your dissertation focused on? Please provide us brief information about those important issues, because the Chamber would like to know about those relevant points for the Chamber.
Was in part a reaction to the belief that the Vietnamese had always pursued an independent foreign policy, which I found to be incorrect, and that the Vietnamese had alternated between being pro-Chinese and being pro-Soviet Union, with a period a brief period in the middle 60s of being neutral between the two communist powers. And therefore, my study of the Soviet-Vietnamese alliance was to highlight the fact that the Vietnamese communists did not always maintain a neutrality between the communists, the rival communist powers, the Soviet Union and China, and that they sometimes took sides between the Soviet Union and China. And the most clear and decisive example of them taking sides was their decision to sign a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union at the end of 1978, just prior to their invasion of Cambodia.
Thank you. Now my question focuses on another book, that is Why Vietnam Invaded Cambodia, Political Culture and the Causes of War. Related to this book, Why Vietnam Invaded Cambodia, when did you start doing research for this book? And when was the book first published? Please hold on.
I started doing research for the book shortly after completion of my dissertation in 1987, probably in 1988 or 89. The book was eventually published in 1999 by Stanford University Press.
Thank you. What methods of research did you use for your study, and what sources you rely on for your writing? Did you interview any important individuals or figures, and if so, how many of them?
Yes, I did interview some important individuals, some very important individuals, most notably His Royal Highness Prince Norodom Sihanouk in Thailand in 1985. I also interviewed Mr. Ieng Sary, former Foreign Minister of Democratic Kampuchea, in Cambodia, in Western Cambodia, in September of 1983. I was then on assignment for the CBS News television network of the United States in Cambodia. And that was the main reason I was able to interview Mr. Ieng Sary. But interviews were just one part of my methods. I studied many secondary sources, all the literature on the subject, but most important, I was able to access the archives of the former Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Going back to the 1930s, when Ho Chi Minh formed the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, I was able to read documents in Moscow written by the Vietnamese communists pertaining to Cambodia, and also records of interviews with Vietnamese communist leaders carried out by Soviet officials pertaining to the problem of Cambodia. So it was a variety of sources that I used.
Thank you. You talked about your interviews with King Norodom Sihanouk and also with Ieng Sary, the former foreign minister of a democratic Cambodia regime. Did you receive the information yesterday from Visu officer for you to bring along those transcripts of interviews, and do you bring along those documents about your interviews with the two figures into this courtroom?
Yes, I did receive a request for copies of the notes made during the interviews. Unfortunately, I was already in Cambodia, and all my source material is in the United States of America. So it was impossible for me to locate these sources.
Thank you, that's all right. Thank you for your answers. To support your writing for the book, did you rely on any materials or equipments provided by other researchers? And if so, what were those materials or equipments?
Well, materials, the writings of other researchers I used. Equipment, no, except not from other researchers. The only equipment that I used was a cameraman or a camera for interview of Ieng Sary, which was provided by the CBS television network of the United States. And a cassette recorder for my interview with His Royal Highness, Prince Norodom Sihanouk, as he was then. But generally, I have used the work of other researchers to provide background for my own work.
Thank you, Mr. Expert. Why were you so much interested in doing research on this particular issue that led to your publication of the book titled Why Vietnam Invaded Cambodia?
I was interested in it because I have for a long time been interested in the political affairs of Vietnam and Cambodia. And I wanted to know why these two former allies came into a military conflict, and in particular when it seems that it was not to the interest of either party for them to be fighting. So I was looking for an explanation of a puzzling event, the war between Vietnam and Cambodia.
Thank you. My last question to you is, can you brief for the chamber about the important events you wrote in your book, the book that we just discussed right now? Can you summarize the important events that you included in your book? I mean the book that we are discussing right now.
Well, basically I try to explain how the Vietnamese Communist Party attempted to control the communist movements of all three countries of Indochina, and I attempt to explain how the Vietnamese lost control of the communist movement in Cambodia, despite their intention to control it. And I also point out the conflicts between the Vietnamese and the Cambodians, which began during the war against the United States-backed regimes, which both the Vietnamese communists and the Cambodian communists were fighting in. In other words, I outline how, at a time when the main enemy of the Vietnamese and Cambodian communists was the United States and its client regimes in Vietnam and Cambodia, nevertheless, the Cambodian communists came to regard the Vietnamese communists as their main enemy. And furthermore, I point out how the Vietnamese communists never fully understood what was going on in Cambodia, that they misunderstood who was for them and who was against them, and finally how they relied upon the assistance of the Soviet Union to undertake what they came to conclude was a necessary invasion in December 1978. But one of the main themes of my book is that all of the parties, or at least the Cambodian communists, the Vietnamese communists, and the Chinese communists, misunderstood their situation. They behaved irrationally and caused consequences which were not in their interests. Negative consequences for all of the three communist parties mentioned. The reason I say that is because the Democratic Kampuchea regime was overthrown by the Vietnamese, and the Vietnamese provoked the Chinese into attacking them, and the Chinese misperceived the actual relationship of the Vietnamese and the Soviet Union in terms of the origins of the conflict. There was a lot of misperception going on, and that's what I try to spell out.
Well, thank you. In the questioning of this expert, what has happened? There is some problems with the translation equipments. So the problem still remain. Please fix it. in the questioning of this expert pursuant to Internal Rule 81 bis. The Chamber give the floor to the Defense Counsel for Nguyen Chia to put question to the expert before other parties. The Defense Counsel for Nguyen Chia, together with the Defense Counsel for Kheo Somporn, have 1 full day to put questions to this expert. You may now proceed, Counsel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Witness, Mr. Expert. I apologize. Before I start, a very small matter in relation to the documents that have just been admitted. It's our understanding that there are still no E3 numbers awarded to those documents. Maybe that could be done because I'll be referring to those documents today and tomorrow. Having said that, Mr. Morris, I have many questions that I would like to put to you. Unfortunately, we only have a day for the defense. Let me tell you very briefly how I would like to ask my questions, what divisions of topics I have, so that you know beforehand a little bit where I'm going. I would like to start asking you some questions on some follow-up questions on your sources and methodology. Then I would like to discuss with you what you in your book and dissertation call the imperial ambitions of the Vietnamese, and I would like to deal with that subject in conjunction with the Indo-Chinese Federation, or the ambition for the Indo-Chinese Federation. Subsequently, I would like to discuss with you some general matters of Vietnamese behavior toward Khmer during their negotiations in general. My fourth subject is Vietnamese communist ideology and its relation toward the Soviet Union and the positions of various Vietnamese Communist Party leaders. Then I will go into an important subject for the defense, which is the way the imperial ambitions or the attempts to establish a Indo-Chinese Federation were implemented in Cambodia, in the revolutionary movement of Cambodia, or in DK. Subsequently, I will address the subject that you also shortly touched upon. That's the DK or the CPK's reaction to the Vietnamese attempts toward DK, and I will be discussing the words that you've been using in your book, paranoia, irrational behavior, etc., or as you just said, why they behaved, why they did. Briefly afterwards, if I still have time, I would like to discuss with you Vietnamese foreign policy versus China and vice versa. And then I would like to discuss a few things about my client, Nguyen Chia, things that you have discovered in the Soviet archives in relation to him. Subsequently, and very briefly, I would like to touch upon reactions versus Vietnam after their invasion, so a brief subject on post-79 opinions and positions of the world versus versus Vietnam, excuse me, and then I will stop, if I still have time, with some main miscellaneous subjects such as diplomatic relations of DK with other countries, and for instance, a Vietnamese attempt to kidnap former King Father Norodom Sihanouk in early 1979, and some other subjects as well. There was a bit of a long introduction. I apologize for this, but then at least you know where I will be going. Let me start, Mr. Morris, with some questions about sources. In your book, you have listed all your secondary sources. Many books are familiar to the parties. We do have excerpts from your dissertation. We were able to microfilm parts of your dissertation. However, we do not have the sources that you used in that dissertation. But is it fair to say that your book, in terms of secondary sources, is building further upon the sources used for your dissertation?
Sorry, sir.
President, please hold on, Mr. Expert.
Yes, that is correct. It is building upon sources used in the dissertation, but also the focus of the book is different to the focus of the dissertation.
I will be touching upon that subject a little bit in more detail later. Let me first ask you some questions in relation to the secondary sources that you have used. It's impossible, of course, to discuss them all. There's a few scholars, American scholars, that I think you use specifically in your book. One of them is an American scholar and I think a former State Department official, Douglas Pike. Could you briefly indicate who Douglas Pike was and how you used his archives that were attached to the University of California in Berkeley?
Douglas Pike was a former State Department official who specialized in Vietnam and was in Vietnam during the war between the United States and North Vietnam. He gathered a large amount of documentary material from his time in service with the U.S. government and placed it in an archive at the University of California, Berkeley, where I was fortunate enough to have 2 years residency during the research for my dissertation. I think Mr. Pike was a very, very avid gatherer of facts from all different sources, and he edited something called the Indochina Chronology, which summarized all the latest writings about Indochina, and also gathered information on events in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia for people to follow.
One follow-up question. I'm sure you are aware that he testified before U.S. Congress in, I believe, October or November 1978. He was asked his opinion on the troubling relations between Democratic Cambodia and Vietnam. Do you know why it was that U.S. Congress asked Douglas Pike to appear before them?
I don't know exactly why, but I believe that it was probably because they were searching for every possible available source of information on the growing crisis in Indochina between the Vietnamese and the Cambodians. So Mr. Pike would have been an obvious person to call to testify.
Thank you for this. In your book, English ERN 01001662, you refer to another American scholar from whose work I will be asking questions as well, and you call him an eminent historian of Vietnam. That's Professor William Duiker or Duker, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. Could you expand a bit on the way you used his work in your book?
I recall using Mr. Duiker's work in some places, but I'm not sure how important he was for my general argument.
Then I will get back to him when I actually want to use one of his observations in his books. Now, of course, in this tribunal, we are intimately familiar with the works of people like Nayan Chanda, Ben Kiernan, Chandler, and Steve Hedder, and others. Let me briefly ask you some questions first about Ben Kiernan. Would it be fair to say that you are not a big fan of Ben Kiernan?
That would be fair judgment.
I'll ask you a follow-up. I think I know why it is, but maybe the Cambodian public doesn't know, so I will ask sometimes questions which are, to me, the answers are obvious, but I will ask them anyway. Can you explain to why that is a fair observation?
Yeah, I believe that Ben Kiernan is a very politicized person who has always had a strong political agenda. During the years of Pol Pot's rule, he was a strong supporter of democratic Kampuchea, but after, and only after, Vietnam turned against democratic Kampuchea, Kiernan became a critic of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, and subsequently Kiernan has taken a position which might be considered in strong alignment with the Vietnamese Communist Party's interpretation of events in Cambodia.
And is it correct that you have actively advocated against his appointment as director of the organization DC Cam?
President, please wait for the microphone to go on, Mr. Expert.
No, I didn't know that he was ever going to be director of DC Cam. You mean you may be referring to something else. You may be referring to.
I do apologize. I mean well, when it was still connected to Yale, his appointment by the State Department in the genocide program, which I believe in the very beginning worked together with DCCAM. But let's move away from DCCAM. Move, please, to what you said about the State Department appointment.
I believed that the State Department's granting of a large sum of American taxpayer money to Ben Kiernan, initially $500,000 and subsequently $1 million, was a tragic mistake, since I believed that he was not the best person to research what happened in Cambodia between 1975 and 1978. I believe that there were other more qualified candidates, such as David Hawke, who had worked with Amnesty International and who I believe would have been a more objective analyst of events in Cambodia and not carrying a political agenda.
Thank you. Now, one other question in relation to someone who has testified here as an expert and has written extensively about the CPK and DK, David Chandler. I was wondering if you ever read his review about your book, Why Vietnam Invaded Cambodia. A review which was, I believe, published shortly after your book appeared. Are you aware of that review? And if yes, could you react to what he says about certain things in your book?
Could you in the meanwhile give us the reference of the review?
Yes, of course. Well, not an E3 number yet, but I do have an ERN already. It's 01335-287, and it's attached to our request E445.
Yes, I am familiar with David Chandler's review of my book, which was in, I believe, the Journal of Asian Studies. I would regard it as somebody else, another scholar described it, as a mixed review, saying there were some good things about the book and some not so good things about the book. But my comment on it is that Mr. Chandler never specified what was the not so good things about the book. He did make the point that there was a lot of new information from Soviet archives contained in my book, which would not be found elsewhere. But like many historians who reviewed my book, or at least some historians who reviewed my book, their criticisms were not of my history, but of my political science, which I found rather ironical. That my argument that there was irrationality was at the center of the conflicts in Indochina, rather than the solidity and veracity of my factual assertions, which nobody challenged, and I believe nobody can challenge.
Thank you for this. Let me move on to another important, other important sources for your work. It was just briefly touched upon by the President, and it is your interview with certain important individuals, important at the time. You mentioned already your interview with Prince Sihanouk. I am particularly interested in an interview you had, I believe, according to your dissertation, in both in Paris and Washington, with a very high-ranking South Vietnamese communist, Trong Nu Tăng. I will be extensively speaking about Trong Nu Tăng, if I pronounce it correctly. But can you describe a bit the parameters of your interview, and specifically, that's the same question that the Chamber has, whether you still have your notes of that interview. But maybe first tell us, for those who don't know who he is, who Trong Nu Tăng is.
Trong Nu Tăng was a former senior figure in the National Liberation Front Provisional Revolutionary Government. He was not, as far as I know, actually a member of the Communist Party. He was, in fact, a member of their front organization, the Vietnamese Communist Party's front organizations. He was an intellectual, and he became disillusioned with the Vietnamese communists during the 1970s after they seized power, and subsequently defected to France, as did some other prominent figures, one of whom I also interviewed, Mr. Bui Tin, former editor of the Army newspaper, who was a Communist Party member.
I will get back to Trung Nhu Tang, and I will discuss the quotes from his memoirs and I believe your interviews. But do you still have your notes from your interviews with him, or are they gone?
I don't believe I have my notes of interviews with him. I met him on several occasions, some of them very informal, the discussions. He was a friend of a Vietnamese friend of mine, and so I had access to him quite often when he came to visit the United States, and so I didn't always feel the need to take notes.
One last question. Is it correct that he is still alive today?
I don't know.
Now let me move to what arguably are maybe your most interesting sources, and that is the Soviet archives. We very briefly touched upon it. You speak about it in your book. We have located another publication from you, which is called the Soviet-Chinese-Vietnamese Triangle in the 1970s. No E3 yet, but it is admitted into evidence. Specifically, I will be referring to English year N013-35245, in which there's a footnote 2 in that article in which you extensively describe how the work was done at the Soviet archives, and the distinction that you made between documents that you were allowed to see and the documents that you were not allowed to see. Can you briefly explain as to what you did in those archives, how access was arranged, etc.?
Yes, access to the archives took place just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Boris Yeltsin, then President of Russia, decided to undertake an investigation into the crimes of the former Communist Party of the Soviet Union, with a view of possibly banning the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in Russia. Following on from Mr. Yeltsin's gathering of a team of experts, mainly Russians, to investigate the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, various international scholarly organizations requested access to the archives as well. That included the Cold War International History Project at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And they managed to get access to the archives for various subjects in the history of the Cold War. I was not involved originally. I did not know about this originally. I went to Moscow on my own, under my own steam as a private individual, found out about the Wilson Center project, and after various efforts, got myself as part of the program. and we were able to request documents from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's Central Committee, as well as the Foreign Ministry. And it was up to officials in the archives to decide whether or not the researchers, of which I was one, would be allowed to see these documents. This project of the Cold War International History Project at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., was not focused on Vietnam or Cambodia. I was the only person who was involved in researching Vietnam and Cambodia. So I went through an index of files that looked like they were relevant to the history of Vietnam and Cambodia, and requested to see files in sequence. There's an enormous amount of information there. For the most part, I was given access to everything I requested. There were very few rejections that I can recall. But may I just point out that the archivists who were making decisions about who would see what were not necessarily experts in the subject that the researcher was investigating. Hence, they couldn't know necessarily what was significant and not significant in the files. Moreover, the requests for review of the files were so voluminous that I cannot believe that the archivists read through the files completely before giving them to the researcher. So I believe that because of all of this, that my access to documents in Moscow was very, very lightly screened. I think that the only possible reason why documents were denied was where they may have been KGB documents which related to agents, for example, perhaps. But as I say, there were very few documents that I was denied access to. But all the documents that I was researching came from the departments of the Communist Party Central Committee dealing with international affairs.
And as I understand, you were not allowed to have to review or to have access to any document belonging to the Politburo of the Central Committee. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And the same applies to the Presidential Archive. Is that correct?
The Presidential Archive is the place where, amongst other things, the Politburo documents were kept.
Can you briefly describe how you worked? I presume you were not all...
I guess there is an issue with the gadget or the headset of the expert. You may now resume your questioning, Counsel.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. My question was about the way you were working while you were investigating the archives. Is it correct that you were not allowed to make copies, that you were only allowed to make notes of the documents that were shown to you?
No, it's not true that I was not allowed to make copies. But as somebody who came to the project very late and was not on the original planning of the project, I was not given a quota of photocopying that the other researchers were given. I think I was allowed something like 100 pages perhaps, whilst the other researchers had 1,000 pages. So I had to do a lot of my recording of documents, handwriting. Actually, my most common method, if the document was very significant, I would handwrite a copy in Russian of the document and translate it later.
Let me be concrete and ask you about one particular example that comes to mind now. In your book, you refer to a transcript of a conversation or a document pertaining a conversation between the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Workers' Party or Communist Party, Le Duan, or Le Yun as we say in Khmer, and the Soviet ambassador. There's a few conversations. Do you have a copy of that actual document, or is it just notes that you took from those documents pertaining these conversations?
This would be notes that I took, probably handwritten Russian copying of part of the document.
Let me be even more concrete. At one point in time, I believe it was 76, and he repeats this in 78, Le Duan tells the Soviet ambassador, Nguyen Chia is our man. He is my personal friend. And we'll get back to that, but do you have that particular document so that if you would be willing to do so, we could have a look at that document, or is it just your notes?
What I have, I don't recall 100% certainty, but I believe that it is transcription of the Russian text in my own handwriting. So if I can locate that document, I could make available my handwritten copy in Russian.
But you do not have the actual document in the Russian document, in which it is noted or annotated that Le Duan says to the Soviet ambassador, Nguyen Chia is our man. That actual document is not in your possession. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you speak and read Russian fluently?
I wouldn't say fluently. I can speak and read Russian, however.
If we were to have very specific questions as to the Russian words used in that conversation, for instance, the characterization by Le Duan of Nguyen Chia, you would be able to provide us with the exact Russian words and its English translation.
I should be able to do that.
One or two brief other questions in relation to your work in the Soviet archives. I read in your book that you were assisted by Dmitry Mazyakov. Is that correct? And if yes, what did he do?
That is correct, and he read the files that I thought might be interesting in advance of my reading them and told me which one specifically I should read. He was a kind of screener for me because of the massive volume of documentation. I needed somebody like that.
And my last question, I will get back obviously to the content of all those very interesting documents. Is it correct that this opening of the archives in 92, 93 was a brief moment, and now they're all closed and God knows when they will open again?
You're partly correct and partly incorrect. It was a very brief moment, which lasted from sometime in 1992 until, late 1991 until April of 1993. However, I have recently discovered that the archives in Moscow, in which I was working, have been temporarily reopened, then closed for relocation, and that they will be reopened again next year. And I hope to be there and to make photocopies of some of those documents that you referred to, so that I can have the hard copy myself.
I would be quite delighted if you would be able to do that, Mr. Morris. My final question, maybe, Mr. President, before the break, and that is comparing your dissertation with your book in 1999. As I said, we only have parts of the dissertation, so for instance, presumably a very interesting chapter on the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68 is something that we do not have. But what we do have from your dissertation, there's overlap and there are some differences. We might get to that. But one specific, very interesting point, which we will address later as well, came to mind, and that is on, I believe, page 461 of your dissertation, which now has English ERN 013-35197, and that is something which is absolutely not in your book, but which is in your dissertation. And let me read that to you. Let me read the excerpt from your dissertation. You're talking about events in 1978. You're talking about Heng Samrin, the Vietnamese creating an armed rebellion movement. We will go into detail later, but here, this is what you say in your dissertation, and I quote: according to a major from the National Army of Democratic Kampuchea, who had defected to Thailand in September, Heng Samrin had attempted a coup against the government in Phnom Penh the previous April. However, the second in command of Heng Samrin's 4th Division, based at Kampong Cham, warned the government and the plot was crushed. Heng Samrin, who was said to have been part of a larger pro-Vietnamese group within the KCP, fled to Vietnam with some of his troops and weapons. Now, I'm not asking you to go into the content of this, because we will when we come to that subject. But can you explain to the Chamber why it is that this is something which we can find in your dissertation, but is nowhere to be found in your book?
No, I'd have to take a look at that excerpt from my dissertation to possibly give you an answer. To be quite honest, I'd forgotten all about it.
We will revisit the subject. Maybe it will jog your memory then. Mr. President, this might be a good moment.
May I just ask, can you do this during the break, or do you have this material with you? You don't? Okay. So
President, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Expert. It is now convenient time for the break. The chamber will take a break from now until 3 o'clock. Court officer, please assist the expert at the waiting room reserved for the expert during the break time and invite him back into the courtroom at